This is Compendium, a podcast about communication and communication research. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with the COM 1000 course at the University of Connecticut. Here now is the host of Compendium, Professor Steve Stifano.
All right, hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the latest episode of Compendium, episode 7. And today we're talking about a topic that I particularly enjoy, one that I spend an awful lot of time talking about, listening to, thinking about, and watching, and I'm sure a lot of you feel the same way. We are talking about sports, and particularly sports communication. Throughout our world, there is so much in the way of athletics, both professional, collegiate, even at the high school level, and technology, media coverage, social media has really had a dramatic impact on the ways in which we consume sports and the ways in which sports are bought and sold. So we're going to spend a significant amount of time today talking about sports and sports communication, a really blossoming field on this topic, with somebody who is an expert in the field, just about to complete his doctorate degree, and by the time you listen to this, might actually have completed his doctorate degree. Michael Mudrick will be joining us today. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and fast forward into that conversation with Mike Mudrick. So my guest today is an expert in sports and sports communication, really. He's also an avid sports fan, so we'll have plenty to talk about. Please welcome the very near future Dr. Mike Mudrick, but for now we'll call him Mike Mudrick. Hi, Mike.
Hello, Steve. Thank you for having me.
So we'll start the way we always start here on Compendium. We'll get some background on you, and then we'll go forward from there. But first things first, where were you born?
Sure, I was born in Philadelphia. Spent most of my life there. I'd say probably my first 25 years of my life before coming to Connecticut.
Well, 25 years. So
yes.
was there any bit of a transition when you came to Connecticut?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, growing up in a city, I did my undergraduate work at Temple University, so that's really in the heart of North Philly. So I grew up a city guy, spent a lot of time, working downtown Philly, and then I thought I would never leave a city-type area, and then things happen, and you're going to come pretty far from a city area when you come to Storrs, Connecticut. So it was an interesting experience, but it was the right decision to make. It's been since 2009 since I've been here, and I can honestly say I'm acclimated now. It's taken long enough, and I enjoy the area. And it's definitely, but like I said, the antithesis of what I grew up with.
Well, certainly. I think it's funny how you said that. When people come to Storrs, Connecticut, it's always something happened,
yes.
and now I'm here.
Yeah, I mean, and you hear those stories prior, but not until you're actually on campus, and you're like, wow, this is very rural out here, obviously. And then when you find out it, started off as an agricultural school, you learn a little bit more about it. And some people did warn me when I came there, you're not going to like it. It's going to be totally out there compared to what you're used to. But it was a great program, and it was a great opportunity for me to come on board here at UConn. So I'm glad I made that decision.
Cool. Well, you certainly seem well settled in,
Yep.
though you won't be necessarily staying for long, but we'll get there a little bit later. So I always ask, and though I know your work is a little bit more on the sports side of things than the communication side of things, but what was your first experience with the field of communication as a student?
Absolutely. I was a journalism major in undergrad. I actually started off to tell that story a little bit, though. I started off in accounting because growing up, people said, "Oh, you're good with numbers, so you should be an accountant." Well, as you get older in life, you realize there's more to that. So I started off as an accounting major, and it really wasn't my cup of tea. But I stayed in the business school at Temple, and switched over to finance. And then at that point, I think maybe a year in finance, I realized this still isn't for me. I want to do something that I enjoy in life. And growing up, I always wrote for the student newspaper in high school. Loved watching, the shows on ESPN, like Pardon the Interruption, Around the Horn. Always read. That was one of the first things that I would do in the morning was I'd come down, while I was having my breakfast and read the sports section. Mm-hmm. And so, I was that wannabe young sports writer. So given that I had that background in high school, after 3 years of undergrad, I decided, I need to do something that I want to do. And so I am going to switch to journalism. It is not just a hobby. It is something I want to do a little bit more long-term. And so I switched my major after 3 years, which some people thought was a little bit of an interesting decision to make, but I did that.
Sometimes a risky decision.
Absolutely. So, but yeah, I switched my major to journalism. So, graduated a year and a half later with a BA in journalism at Temple. Had some really good media opportunities too while I was there. That is the benefit of going to a school in a big city, the opportunities that you can have. So,
right.
I landed an internship with the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is the major newspaper in the Philadelphia area. So I covered a lot of high school sports. Did a little bit of college here and there, feature stories and such. So I had that for about 6 or 7 months and learned a lot. Had a really good internship with one of the sports talk radio stations in Philadelphia. There's, similar like how Boston has the Sports Hub and WEEI as the two major stations. In Philadelphia, we have WIP, which for years has been, the major station, really picked up in the early 90s like Sports Talk did. And then in the mid-2000s, the ESPN affiliate, which is now known as 97.5 The Fanatic, came to fruition. And I was one of the first interns for the morning show that we had. I guess that was the fall of 2006.
Okay.
So really good experience to also get a perspective on sport radio and what goes into that. So those are some of my media experiences. And then after graduation, I started writing for the Rivals.com network and primarily covered football and men's and women's basketball at Temple. So a lot of good experience there. I attribute the majority of my success as a sport journalist to my editor at the time, who's become one of my good friends, John DiCarlo, and he's just been a really terrific writer over the years, and so I felt like I developed a lot under him. So I had some really good times covering Temple basketball. I saw the growth of Temple football. I mean, the program almost collapsed. I think they were one vote shy from their board of trustees of just eliminating the football program.
Wow.
Back in 2006, and But actually, I think that was 2005. But then Al Golden came in 2006 and, rebuilt the program, to some extent. And they became at least competitive again. And so I was a part of that, covering that. And then, with the retirement of John Chaney at Temple, legendary coach, and seeing some of the things that Fran Dunphy did when he took over. And I guess he's been on the job maybe 8-9 years now at Temple.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So got to experience, some of their runs. I got to cover an NCAA tournament game in Denver. I mean, they got smoked by Michigan State, but it was a good experience to go out there and cover an NCAA tournament game, cover multiple conference tournaments games, the Atlantic 10 Conference at Boardwalk Hall in Atlantic City at the time. So a lot of really cool experiences. And so I decided, though, after a few years of that, that I wanted to pursue sports a little bit more as a field. Unfortunately, there are some risks with journalism, and even though there are a lot of web jobs and design jobs, I wouldn't argue with certain people that say that print journalism is a dying breed, or a dying field. So at that time, I decided, I want to go back to school, want to remain working in athletics, and so that's where I ended up at UConn in terms of pursuing a master's degree in sport management. And so did that for 2 years and then decided to stay on for the PhD, and that's where I'm at now.
So what was it specifically that made you decide to stay on for the PhD and consider a career more towards the academic lifestyle?
I attribute that to the advisor that I had. I guess I had a good presence in front of the classroom when I was doing projects as a first-year master's student. And my advisor at the time, Dr. Janet Fink, had recommended to me that, perhaps you should look into getting a PhD. I had never thought about it before. And so, the saying I use is sometimes someone says something to you, you never thought about it prior, and the light goes off. And from that point forward, I thought, I definitely think I could do this. I think from a research perspective, I'm very, inquisitive. I'm very curious about a lot of sport-related things and how could we test certain aspects of sport fandom. She also was a tremendously big sport fan, Ohio State sport fan. And so we clicked with my avid sport fandom and her avid sport fandom. So from a research perspective, we talked a lot about nuances of fandom. So we thought, okay, this will be good for a PhD from that perspective,
right?
But also from a teaching perspective, which is what I truly love doing. She thought that I would be a really good fit to continue for the PhD.
It's funny because in our experience, we seem to have two breeds of people, and it seems like your breed actually outnumber the other breed. There's one breed that says, "Oh, I always wanted to be a professor. I just, I got in a classroom one day and I saw the guy up there or the lady up there, and I said, that's what I want to do." And then there's a second breed where it seems like it's very late in the academic career of I just kept going further and further, and then, like you said, the light went off, and next thing you know, you've got a bunch of people staring at you, and you've got to give a lecture, and you're kind of just doing it.
Yep.
So it's interesting to see the different ways in which people arrive at this destination. So was there ever a moment, even in that career, once you started to pursue that PhD, where you said, no, this is it, I want to be a college professor? Because I think some people pursue the PhD and still have some options open. Were you dead set on it?
Yes, I was, and I attribute that directly to my advisor at the time and the other faculty in our department. I think when I came to UConn, that was the first time I actually experienced being in like a small classroom as well, and just a lot of student-instructor attention. And so I really got the perspective of them of just how much they enjoy doing it, and it just radiated their positive energy, and I was hooked. So I think it literally just took a semester, and I said, this is absolutely what I want to be. So.
Yeah, and it's a great answer, because I really do feel like, and I think I've heard from students, I'm sure you've gotten some feedback from students, but when it's clear that you care about what you're doing, and when it's clear that the person sort of leading the charge is completely passionate about the subject matter, it does make learning a heck of a lot easier, and it makes the whole thing more interesting. So it's good to hear that you're as invested as I kind of knew you were when I asked you to be on the podcast. So okay, let's transition into the actual reason you're here today, and I'd like to start because this conversation's about sports communication, but I think for a lot of our listeners, it's important that we get an overview of exactly what that is. So could you give us an overview of sports communication?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it is a very emerging and growing field. Obviously, communication and mass media as a whole will always have value and can be very broad. But I think with the emergence of sport as such a strong focus in society, that there are aspects of mass media and communication that are unique from a sport lens. So I think it can be really broken down into three different aspects that I focus on, at least in the class that I teach. And the emergence of social media has become tremendous, especially coming from a sport perspective. I don't know what the exact number is, but I saw something this week that, I think it was like close to over 50% perhaps of like tweets during television program are all sport related. So I think when we add that sport hook, that allows for an interesting lens to examine when it comes to sport communication. Obviously, sport mass media is continuing to evolve. I think of it from a perspective of a journalist as well, that you're constantly on the job in terms of breaking news, and not that other reporters don't have to constantly be on social media breaking news, but there's sport. Given off seasons, everything is such a we need to know who's signing with who,
right?
Who is recruiting who in college athletics. So I think it's really up the ante on terms of the responsibilities and the tasks of a sport reporter, but also has influenced the sport consumer to be a lot more knowledgeable and a lot more interested in the product, because there's that constant desire for more attention. But then also public relations. Yeah. Sport is going to be that unique breed, and because the consumers are so invested in sport that we say in sport marketing, it's a double-edged sword in terms of working in sport. The positive, look how great everything was for Tiger Woods pre-2009, right, and just all the exposure and how much that makes I don't want to say your life easier, but makes you more prominent. But when things go bad, boy, do we really blow things up in the media because of our immense interest in sports. So I think
it seems like that 180 can happen almost instantly.
Absolutely.
Too, within a matter of an hour.
Yes. So, and I tie it all back to, the 24/7 exposure. I mean, look at how many different channels of ESPN that we have. But fans want that. It's not like we're throwing it at them and if they're not consuming, those products aren't out there.
Certainly.
So, we as sport fans, I think, are so knowledgeable and are so invested because of sport. And we're just, compared to where things were 10, 15 years ago, things have really, really changed, and I think we're as hooked as ever. So my long answer to that with regard to sport communication is I think it applies to a lot of the principles of communication, but because the field is so unique, there are a lot of interesting things to consider.
It's almost as if across almost all forms of sport, people seem to be more invested in the communication. There's almost more at stake. And now this is interesting, of course, because there's plenty of people, and probably some people listening, who would argue, no, there's less at stake. I mean, it's a game. But most sports fans don't look at it that way. And I know that you and I are both big sports fans, and when we talk about something that's ongoing with sports, we don't look at it that way. Would you say that's generally the case, that the investment is higher in sports fans, and that changes the playing field a little bit?
Absolutely. It is the immense emotional attachment we have, and that's because of sport. We'll say in class, unfortunately, you're not going to be upset when your toothpaste lets you down. You buy a new thing of Crest toothpaste, and you're like, hey, that wasn't really as good as I thought it would be. But, one of the worst things in life, sadly, I don't even know if I'd say sadly, but, that feeling the day after you wake up when your team has a bad loss, because it's all about social identity theory in that, the team is a self-extension of you. Mm-hmm. And so when the team loses, you lose. Yeah. And that's all due to that emotional attachment that you have. So, and I think that's what drives a lot of the sport communication. That's why people are tweeting so much that, I'll admit, I was doing it the other day. Ryan Howard misses a pop-up in foul territory against the Red Sox the other night in a key moment. And I'm like, not only is this guy not hitting anymore, but, his fielding is subpar, and he's getting paid $25 million a year. So I think, the emotional attachment. But again, because we were watching so much sport media and we're reading so much about sport, we're more knowledgeable than we were 10, 15 years ago. And I attribute that directly to the media access that we have. Mm-hmm. So because we're more at least we perceive that we're more knowledgeable.
Right.
We act like we're experts on the topic. Now, granted, I'm sure you put me in a room with, a bunch of executives of the sport organization, and they'll prove me wrong. But I feel like, hey, because of what I'm exposed to, that I am that expert.
And it does seem like for a lot of us that we have a sufficient platform of knowledge to work from, that you're right. When these conversations happen, we feel incredibly invested and incredibly knowledgeable, reputable. And of course, this raises the whole media effects angle, and we've been talking a little bit in the course about media effects, and then this upcoming week when we actually do sports communication and whatnot, we're going to talk about it more. But we also must acknowledge that a lot of the information that we get are from sources that very clearly either have an agenda or have just very much selectively provided content based on what they think will promote ratings.
Yes, that's, I don't want to pick on individuals too much, but you wonder about some of the stuff that comes out on some of these shows on ESPN. Like, I think of First Take in particular, certain hosts that I think just put stuff out there just to draw a rise out of people. And I think we could absolutely say that about sport radio.
Yeah.
And, it ties into that knee-jerk reaction that fans are, that fans have, but also, again, when we let the emotions get the best of us.
And emotions drive attention. And that's true in a lot of different fields of communication and a lot of different domains. But realistically, it's hard to find a bigger group of people more invested in a given thing in this universe than sports fans about sport. Especially what we see here in America in terms of the media side of it. But then, I think a lot of us get very ethnocentric in America and think, oh, well, it's just because we care so much. But look around, just look at soccer across the world and look at the passion that you see there in all sorts of countries and all sorts of backgrounds. So it really has kind of gripped the universe, if you will. And I think you're right. I think the identity thing, where we really do extend and kind of put ourselves in there and find ourselves immersed in the content, because we think, for me as a Patriots fan, when Tom Brady's driving down the field in the Super Bowl, I want it as much for Tom Brady as I do for myself, so that I don't have to sit there with you as a Philadelphia Eagles fan and have you potentially say something like, well, they got lucky a couple times and then they've lost a couple times. And it is a very interesting sense of investment that we all have in it. And just go out in public, go to a sports bar and look around during a big game. I mean, it's a very interesting scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the first studies in sport fandom noted that, fans are more likely after a team is successful to refer to the team as we, even though, they didn't play it down for the Patriots, or they're also more likely to say they when things go bad, so they're trying to distance themselves. So, they try to take the good when it's there, and they don't want the bad when it exists. But I mean, even so, just like what you said, it's that self-extension. I was listening to WEEI on my way in this morning, and there were some complaints about the Boston Bruins' lethargic effort last night.
Yes, I heard that too.
Yeah, like you're... Obviously, the playoffs are on the line. It does not look good as we speak right now. And I, as a Philadelphia Flyers fan, I desperately do not want the Pittsburgh Penguins in the playoffs. So I would like to see the Bruins get in, but they're in a big hole right now. But because I think of that self-extension, a lot of the fans and even the sports talk hosts were a little bit peeved that it just seemed like the team didn't seem to have that drive that, they needed to be all in at the end of the season. And so we want, our teams to behave as if we feel we should behave as fans.
Right.
And that body language does radiate due to that self-extension aspect.
And nothing might be more frustrating than, we really want our teams to embody the values that we have. And we're very convenient about setting those values aside when they don't match. So if somebody is a really great player and they're convicted of some kind of a crime, then you see a lot of sports fans suddenly rationalize how something that if the guy in the cubicle overdid it, they'd flip out about and say, I can't work next to this person. Suddenly that's okay, it's acceptable. But when it comes down to performance, I think a lot of people would like to think they're hard workers, would like to think they're passionate, would like to think they do everything it takes to succeed. And especially when it comes to an athletic setting, they do everything it takes to win. So when you see a team dragging on the field or on the ice or on the court, suddenly it gets very different. And I think people start to get a lot more frustrated. I think, and as a sports fan myself, I don't think anything infuriates me more than watching a team that I don't think is giving full effort. Now, do I know the circumstances, or do I trust myself to properly define full effort in that given sport? No. I mean, 2/3 of those sports out there, I'd probably make a fool of myself if I even tried to play them. But nonetheless, as a fan, like you said, we see enough media, we've been exposed to enough information, we start to think we're good at this and we can comment on it.
Yeah, and I think, geographic regions play a part in it. I truly believe that the East Coast fan is a special fan, and we embody that even more. Yes, we want you to play well, but, fans in Boston, fans in New York, fans in Philly, maybe even the D.C. area as well, there's a certain type of player that we seem to cling to a little bit more. And I can say as a Phillies fan, Jimmy Rollins did rub people the wrong way a lot of times, and that, he even freely admitted it. I'm not going to run 100% on a ground ball to second base every time because, it may not be necessary, it may not be wise for injury purposes, but, we appreciate the Dustin Pedroias, the Chase Utleys who just constantly, are going all out on every play. And I think the East Coast sport fan really embodies that work, lunch worker type of player. Yes, obviously we appreciate the stars like Tom Brady, but, we love the stories about, I don't know, you could name some Patriots players that I think would resemble that better than I could. But, I think that's a reason why, at least from a Philadelphia perspective, guys like Chase Utley always resonated because, he resembled what we wanted or how we grew up. And I just remember when Jim Thome signed with the Phillies back in, I guess it was 2004, a lot of the electrical union workers came out and greeted him when he came to visit the city and came to visit the Phillies and ended up signing with them. But I guess he grew up in a very working class family. His dad was a union electrical worker, and so I think we really embraced him from that perspective as well. But I think it's very unique on the East Coast, and I love it. And I do also agree a lot. There are certain things that people say that certain players can't play in certain cities because of the pressure of the fan base. And I think the type of player that we want in these markets is legitimate. And, it is an interesting thing to examine whether or not a certain style can work in a certain environment. And so I definitely think geographic regions does play a role.
So it's interesting, and this conversation kind of just sort of opens itself up, and I'm sure you encounter this on a daily basis. I know just as a sports fan, I encounter it on a regular basis. But as we talk, to kind of transition this a little bit, we are also talking about a lot of prospective things that are worth investigating further. And you're obviously a researcher, so I was curious if you could maybe tell us about the research you're doing, because there's clearly so many topics that are worth discussing or investigating or trying to figure out what really makes this happen? So what is it that you're investigating as a researcher in sports communication?
Okay, so I'd like to say that my research has sort of branched off into two aspects of sport management, we'll say. The study of fan behavior, I'll say a study of peculiar fan behavior, and I attribute some of that to sport communication, and then some mass media studies. So just to give you a little bit of background, even though it's not as much comm related, but in terms of what I've done with regard to peculiar fandom.
Sure.
I think a lot of this, as cliched as it sounds, a lot of the research that we do, we say it's me search. It's things that affect us. It's how we behave, and we say, oh, well, has that been done before? So again, and it ties back to my roots as just being I perceive myself to be very knowledgeable about sports, but also being a Philadelphia fan. So I think it's pretty obvious right now, if you're in tune with the NBA, that the Sixers have an interesting rebuilding plan. And some may call it tanking, others may call it rebuilding. But
I call it not even showing up.
Yes, yes. But there's also ways to tank. There's, I think the Sixers are actually doing it the right way in that they're building from the ground up with young players. And then you've got teams like the Knicks who have a lot of veteran players, and they're just a mess out there, and they're okay with losing. But this has been a new phenomenon, and I think it ties into, we can go a whole other route with regard to this, but in the NBA, the competitive balance is not strong, and it is very difficult to get good in the NBA. A lot of teams get stuck in that purgatory area, they say, that you need to get stars in order to win. If you can't get stars via free agency, you got to get them through the draft. Look at how Oklahoma City got great. They got Kevin Durant high, they got Russell Westbrook high in the draft, they got James Harden high in the draft, and they were able to flip them and such.
Right.
So the best way to get good is to get lucky in the draft. So I think fans are becoming more accepting that, hey, if that's the way to go to get a star player, then maybe I'm okay with my team losing. If it's about the team is a self-extension of you. We say it's vicarious achievement. When the team wins, you feel like you win. But if the team loses, do you feel like you've lost? If you're embracing teams lose. So this concept of openly rooting for team failure kind of goes against the grains of what sport fandom is.
Right.
So I wanted to study that, and I've done a little bit of research on that to look at, A, do people openly support their teams failing? And B, for what reasons? And what I have found out was that fans who are high in sport knowledge, and I didn't do it based on perception of sport knowledge, because obviously people are going to overinflate how knowledgeable they think they are.
Right.
But actually, I came up with this sport knowledge test, had some experts in the field, measure it and evaluate it. So I found that fans that were high in sport knowledge supported team failure because they noticed they were understanding of the ramifications via securing high draft picks and knowing that in order to get good in a lot of sports, not only do you have to get superstar players, but you also need young superstar players because they're cheaper. It's before they're hitting free agency and making a lot of money.
Right.
So that's a good way to build your team. So fans support it for that rationale, but fans also supported their teams to fail because they may want, a coach or a general manager fired. And I think that, again, ties into the aspect of social identities and that, we see that person's a bad representative of our organization. And so, hey, if we need to root for everything to bottom out in order for mass changes to be made, perhaps that's the way to go. I will admit I have done that on many of occasions, and kind of thinking about that right now with regard to a certain baseball team in Philadelphia, because I really don't know what's going on with management there. Very, very ass backwards, as we say, is how they're at least trying to rebuild their team. So that's an aspect of peculiar fandom I've looked at. I've also been a part of a study looking at producing a scale to measure emotional attachment to sport team, which we've discussed. Obviously, that's what makes sports so unique. But also, and then tying into a little bit about communication. Given my background in working for the Rivals.com network and writing for AlScoop.com, looking at why people would monetarily subscribe to these college recruiting networks. College recruiting networks have really blown up since, I guess the mid to late 90s perhaps. You've got your Rivals.com, your Scout.com, your 24/7 Sports. And so why would people be willing to plunk down $10 a month or $120 a year to ingest as much material as possible with their favorite sport teams? I mean, it's, why would you not just, follow, the Hartford Courant instead of subscribing to one of these UConn, sites? There's some interesting aspects and what I found as to why people would monetarily subscribe to these sites. So I found that segmented information gain is one thing that people were interested in. And, why go to the Hartford Courant? Because they'll cover multiple sport teams in this area. But if I go to a UConn specific site, I know I'm getting specifically the information that I want for my favorite team. So that was one interesting aspect. I'll tell you one unique thing that I found, and that's just because I interviewed people. This was a qualitative study. Interviewed fans who subscribed to Temple's site, AlScoop.com, fans that subscribed to Go for Illustrated, which was Minnesota's Rivals.com site. One fan that subscribed to Peaks.com, which is Indiana's Rivals site, and I think it was the Rivals. It might be their Scout site, but regardless. And then also a contingent of fans who subscribed to Penn State 24/7, and a lot of them. This was obviously a unique and interesting finding that we found, that after everything went down with the Jerry Sandusky scandal at Penn State, obviously the majority of the nation, had a lot of hatred toward Penn State, and even Penn State fans as well, for what had gone on. And a lot of their fan base used the message board aspects of these sites and the whole sense of community that you have with these sites to be able to discuss what happened and move forward as a fan base. And because it's a pay site, you're less likely to have these dysfunctional lunatics from maybe other schools that are coming in just to start trouble.
The trolls.
Exactly. So to be on a site which I'm paying for, it's going to be a little bit more prestigious. It's going to be a little bit more premium. And because they're all on the same side as I am, I can have a healthy conversation. And a lot of these fans used these sites, at least from a Penn State perspective, as a mechanism to move forward, to really digest, okay, what happened? How do we move forward as a fan base? And, they really attributed these sites to the healing process. Because, again, the self-extension that they felt, they lost just as much as Penn State football did as well.
So they created a sort of almost a subculture, if you will, or a safe haven for appreciation, fandom, and in-group, if you will.
Yeah.
And then they used it as a coping device.
Yes.
And a communication device.
Absolutely.
So I think that makes a lot of sense because, whether it's as a sports fan or even in other fields, I don't know if you've ever looked at the forums for the Chronicle of Higher Education. It's an interesting perspective just for academics, for professors and aspiring professors to get advice about kind of navigating, finishing up your graduate degree, looking for a job, all this stuff. And I think a lot of discussion boards serve that purpose. But when it comes to sports fandom, like you said, there's a lot of very dramatic emotional swings. And with a story like that, the actual emotional swings transition beyond we lost the game or this player didn't play well to a life thing. Do you really want to be aligned, or do you want a brand or an identity that you really feel passionate about to be aligned with something as tragic and horrific as what Jerry Sandusky was involved with?
Yes.
So it really is interesting to see that those kinds of things popping up. So I think that your research is onto a number of things, and I think that you really found some interesting stuff there with that qualitative data. Yeah,
and again, that would be that rich breadth aspect is a benefit to doing qualitative research. So it was a fun study to do. Got a lot of really good perspectives. Other things that people use those message boards to vicariously perform as journalists. Like, hey, I know a guy who's got information, and that's something you need to balance. Like, is this person legit, or are they just throwing crap against the wall? But some people like to use these sites to help break news as well. Or you had parents of players that would go on and use these message boards to sort of squash certain rumors that were going on because they knew the real deal of what was going on with certain programs.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just it's interesting. These sites, they're really have grown in prominence over the years.
Well, a theme that we keep coming back to in COM 1000 is this whole, the first portion of the class we did the foundations of communication, but then we talked a lot about interpersonal in the second third of the class, and now for this final third we're talking about media and mass communication. But I continue to argue, as they say in the computer-mediated communication literature, it's mass personal. It's not just mass. And what you've evidenced is a great example of that, that when you start to watch fan behavior and see kind of how fans interact, there's a lot of media consumption going on. And the data being there and the information being there and the reports being there. And sometimes it's not even anything substantive. It's just somebody writing on and on with a hunch or a suspicion. And it may even be framed that way, but people want to get more of it. But then what do? They promptly take it back to a whole bunch of other people who are in the same emotional state and say, okay, we've got a situation here. This person says this person says that. What do you think? What are you doing with it? So on and so forth. So it really is a mass personal concept where it's sort of both these processes at work together.
Absolutely. I think, specifically to hone in on that example, I'm thinking when the free agency period in the NFL just started, maybe a month ago at this time.
Yep.
And, me being an Eagles fan, and right after, the league season began, I hear on Twitter that the Eagles have traded Nick Foles, and we're like, oh, wow, that was a shock. Okay, maybe they're probably going to make a quarterback change. Everyone thinks, they're going to go get Marcus Mariota because he played for Chip Kelly at Oregon, fits the system. But first we hear, okay, Nick Foles is traded. And then we hear, okay, he's traded to St. Louis for Sam Bradford. Why that doesn't make sense. I don't, this guy's, injured. he doesn't seem to be, that fit for Chip Kelly's system, what we perceive to be Chip Kelly's system, the prototypical quarterback. And so I'm texting, some of my friends, and we're trying to, synthesize, okay, what's the rationale for this? Right. We're breaking it down. But then we also hear some reporters say, okay, there's draft picks involved. And there was an initial report that they had flipped 20 and 10, and that the Eagles would get the 10th pick of the first round and St. Louis would get the 20th pick. So then we're like, okay, this is all making sense. Sam Bradford might just be a one-year rental. If they can move up to 10, maybe you get Mariota at 10, or you can then, flip the 10 and something else to move up to get Mariota. And so we're all having this dialogue amongst, the fan base, my friends, and, we're texting each other back and forth. Meanwhile, the reports keep changing. They weren't flipping first-round picks. And, one team's getting a first round, and the other team's getting a second. And then we find out later, okay, no one was doing anything in the first round, but the Eagles next year are giving up a second-round pick. So, we're just constantly, we're taking that information from the media, and we're just we're analyzing it amongst ourselves and spewing it back out there. And then you've got the dysfunctional fans who are, going at it with reporters on social media for not having the most accurate information or for not even getting the scoop on that information. It's a whirlwind. And again, it's what makes sport unique.
Yeah, no, certainly. Okay, so based on this, we've kind of gotten away from it a little bit in the last couple of minutes, but you talked a lot about college fan culture. I'm curious, as somebody who both works at this university, presumptuously roots for this university, what do you see here in UConn fan culture and the sport culture here at the University of Connecticut? We obviously have a heavy sport culture for the size school we are, and we're obviously very passionate about our sports, but what do you see from your perspective?
I see, I don't disagree, obviously a little biased, but I don't disagree that this is the college basketball capital of the world. And I believe it was before a game last season, when Larry Brown first came to a game at Gamble when SMU came. I think he made a comment to the student section. He may have made a comment in the post game that it is one of the best student sections in the country, one of the toughest atmospheres. And yes, I see a fan base, at least from a basketball perspective, that is all in, that is very passionate, great environment. I haven't gone to a plethora of games at Gamble or even Excel since I've been here, but I think there are some benefits in that, there are a lack of professional teams, and we have the Connecticut Sun here in Connecticut, and we've got, a PGA Tour event in Connecticut, but a lack of professional focus then shifts the attention to UConn. So you don't necessarily even have to be an alumni. You can, live in Holland and you're supporting UConn because they're considered your professional team. So I think there's a benefit there from the culture of UConn athletics. But I think basketball, it's a tremendous atmosphere. There's a lot of success, and let's be honest, that drives a lot of that. What Jim Calhoun was able to do, in taking over the men's basketball program and really build it into the empire that it became. And then obviously, we can't say enough great things about what Coach Gino Auriemma has done and how, they started off at the field house, and it was basically, really from the ground up, and to build it into, 10 national championships. But, it seems that the fan base travels very well. I mean, that was, one of the constant themes from the players and coaching staff when they came back from Tampa this past week was that, it was great atmosphere because of the UConn fan base. So I think from a basketball perspective, they're really you'd be hard-pressed to find a greater campus to be on. And I grew up in college basketball being, we say in Philadelphia, we call it the Big Five. Even though we are a professional town with the Sixers, you've got Temple, St. Joe's, Villanova, LaSalle, and Penn. And then you also have Drexel as like that sixth school. Very big into college basketball because the city teams all play each other. So I've always been, a tremendous follower of college basketball. And what better place to come than UConn to see that. And just also, I think it's neat just how, at least specifically the last two championships that UConn has won. Yes, they were a 3 seed back in 2011, but to go on that run with Kemba Walker, it was fun to be a part of. I think we saw, a lot of people attribute after that pick game when he had that crossover and hit the jumper that, okay, this may be something special. And then last year, let's be honest, they got very much slighted as a 7 seed. They should have been higher. There's
certainly
definitely some conference bias there. I despise both St. Joe's and Villanova, so to have UConn knock them out in the first 2 rounds was great. So I think that just it makes it fun. We talk about expectancy theories in sport fandom and how, yes, as fans, we expect our teams to do positive, but when we don't expect them to go on runs and they do it, it's even greater than when we're the favorite and we win.
Yeah.
We say that's positive disconfirmation. So I think, as UConn men's basketball fans, we've dealt with that over the past few years in a good way. Obviously, it's been positive confirmation with the women's team because they've just been so strong and so dominant, but just a tremendous culture here. Obviously, football, they're in a state of flux right now. When I first came here in 09, a little bit more competitive on the field, and the atmospheres were pretty fun down at Rentschler Field. I spent my first year actually working on the sidelines for the athletic department, and I think my title was the sideline engineer. I don't know what the sideline engineer. I forget what it was. Sideline coordinator. That's what it was. Basically, my job was to report up to the press box if there were certain injuries, and then I helped out with press conferences and such afterward. But I mean, there were some night games that year, I remember, so that helped boost attendance, but some pretty raucous crowds. I remember that year, Syracuse played a game at Rentschler Field, and their quarterback at the time was Greg Paulus, who used to play point guard for Duke. I've never heard such horrible things yelled to an individual as they're running in and out of the locker room and on the field. And, it was a pretty raucous atmosphere. So, going to games in previous years, that hasn't been the case. Now, I am very hopeful that, the rebuild that is going on will help get UConn back to that level. But unfortunately, I do think that they are at a disadvantage in playing games off campuses, which a lot of schools have to deal with.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of room for improvement, but I'm very optimistic because I have a lot of faith in the administration here at UConn. I think Ward Manuel is one of the best athletic directors in the country. Debbie Coram, Associate AD, I think is tremendous. And I really we need to be patient, and that's not always easy as sport fans, but I think, if we give it some time, things are being done the right way with football, that perhaps we can get back into that discussion that, we can have football with men's and women's basketball here. And let's not slight, the success that baseball and field hockey have had in previous years as well. I think that also adds to the culture that this is just a tremendous university to be a part of athletically.
And I think that we as academics sometimes struggle with this dilemma, and I know some feel very strongly one way or the other about it. But I'll tell you, in all my travels, when I say I'm from the University of Connecticut or go to a national or even an international conference, they go, oh, UConn and basketball. And as much as a lot of times we in the academic realm are like, no, it's not about basketball, I think the name recognition helps, and I do think that it translates in some ways, sometimes directly, but really sometimes indirectly. The school has a reputation for success, and it carries that reputation because of the popularity of sport in a lot of cases. And obviously, if you look at the university from an academic perspective, it's developed as well. And the research that we're doing and the work that we're doing in our respective fields is really starting to shine. And even our communication program here at UConn has really been on the rise of late. So I do think that it all kind of comes as a package deal when people look at a university, and we could spend 2 hours talking about the relationship between sports and academics at higher education institutions. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time, but it is an interesting but sometimes challenging thing to navigate.
Absolutely, and that's the power of sport. If whether we like it or not, success of a college sport team is going to be a tremendous recruiting tool, and we can't necessarily quantify that. So it behooves the university very much to be on that stage, especially thinking of out-of-state tuition too. If you can impact, someone from a different state to want to come because they saw that team on television, financially that's much more benefit for the university as well. So one of the things that when I taught sport finance last year is we started one of the classes looking at the finances of college athletics, especially with the out-of-state students, was, why did you end up coming to UConn? And everything tied back to, I grew up watching them have success in basketball, and that made me want to be a part of that. Yeah. So, and that also diversifies your undergraduate base as well. Yeah. So it does help the school.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so now we'll get away from the UConn-centric questions, but let's take a big step back and look at this field as a whole. How do you think the world of sports is doing in handling all these new communication technologies, whether it's social media with something like Twitter or just the influx of media content we've talked about? We see athletes tweeting now and having this direct connection to people. We see mistakes being made, but we also see some good stuff happening. How do you feel it's going?
I think it's going in the right direction. I mean, we're always going to have to take the good with the bad, but I think it allows for that more intimate connection that fans can have with specific athletes, that fans can have with teams. And I think if you're very strategic as a sport organization, you use that to your advantage. Yeah. So if you're on board and you think outside the box, I think especially from a social media perspective, you have to get on board. And also it's free, free advertising. So that's something to consider as well. But it's just this unique, intimate connection that other avenues don't have. So I see it as a positive aspect, but I'm all about continuing to have coverage, because also thinking about it, I'm a numbers guy, thinking about it financially. If people are going to continue to watch, then you're going to have better television ratings. What happens when you have better television ratings? You could charge more money, more revenues come in, and teams make more money, and then players make more money as well. So financially, if people are going to continue to consume, we got to get on board. So let's just keep, will we hit a threshold? Perhaps. I got to be honest, I was watching the NFL Network yesterday, and, I guess they were debating already about fantasy football, who was a sleeper and who was a riser for next year. We're so far out. We don't know what's going to happen. But, so at that point I think of, okay, maybe this is too much. Maybe, having an NFL Network, that has to constantly drum up coverage around the clock. Maybe there are some bad aspects because we're really fishing for things at this time of year. But, when it comes down to it, it keeps us hooked. So I think from a pure numbers standpoint, it's what keeps us on that, as we say, the consumer escalator. Yeah. So I think it's positive, this continued expansion. But yeah, social media has really changed the gamut, and I understand there's some issues with dysfunctional fandom, but that's the only way that I would be able to have a connection with a player. That in the past, when I was a little kid, I used to love Greg Maddux and Tommy Glavine. They were my type of pitchers, and I do remember writing like a letter to Tom Glavine. I never heard back. Still bitter about it. But, now I could perhaps, follow Jimmy Rollins, and not that, he maybe reads everything we say, but we can send him a message, and we could just feel like a part of it, especially, again, thinking of that self-extension. When, players communicate with the fans after the game, perhaps on social media, perhaps celebrating, again, we feel better about ourselves as fans. So, I think it's fun, and it's only going to continue to go in a whole gamut of directions. But I think it really does also help for branding purposes for athletes.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about next is so when we look at social media, particularly from a public relations perspective, it's easy to use social media, and we talk about this a lot in the course across all different domains. It's really easy to use Facebook. It's easy to use Twitter, Instagram, any of these platforms. It's really hard to use them well, especially when you've got a brand at stake. And we even argue in the course that, your personal brand is at stake as individuals. But can you talk about it from a team perspective, the kind of work that needs to go in to create a successful public relations campaign for a sport team?
Well, it's difficult. In thinking about it from a player perspective, I know in thinking from college athletics as well, most coaches will ban their players from using social media during the season. That exactly is the case with women's basketball. Coach Ariema does not want them on. What good can come from certain things? Pictures getting put out there, locker room material for another team. Yeah. So that makes it difficult if you're using it to enhance your brand from your sport organization. But there's also the perspective of a John Calipari who wants his players using it so they can learn, to act responsibly and to polish their brand. And look at what happened, unfortunately, this past weekend with one of the Harrison brothers, I forget which one, that used a racial slur in the press conference, but then was able to use social media as a mechanism to offer his apology and explain that he reached out to Frank Kaminsky and at least apparently all is well, and that the apology was accepted. So there's, from an individual standpoint, it can be difficult, especially thinking about college athletics, because we don't always think before we hit the send button. But I think the teams that do it well, it radiates, even from a perspective of I talked about this week public relations campaigns, and I think an interesting thing that the Sixers are doing right now with the success that Nerlens Noel has had the second half of the season. A lot of people think Andrew Wiggins should be the Rookie of the Year, and he's had a tremendous year, scored a lot of points. But looking at some of the numbers that Nerlens Noel has posted over the second half of the season, as a rookie, only I think David Robinson is like a player that he stacked up with in terms of the amount of points, rebounds, blocks, and steals he's averaged per game. So using that as a campaign to generate interest, for Nerlens Noel as Rookie of the Year, I think helps just from a team branding perspective. but also gets the fan base a little bit more. But yeah, he is doing really well, and maybe I'm going to support Nerlens Noel a little bit more. So it could be used, a whole slew of ways, and it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that those campaigns are often not even noticed by the casual fan as a full-on media effort. But you're right, it is very useful. So I'd like to flip it around though. Hopefully there's one that jumps out at you. But what do you think is maybe the most egregious mistake you've seen people commit on social media related to sports?
I think we just let our emotions overtake us. I think one of the most egregious things, and I mentioned it in a paper that I've worked on, I remember a few years back, I guess it was Oklahoma State football. I forget what fan base, and I should know this because we wrote about it in the paper, but one of their biggest rivals, I guess, tweeted at some players before the game and wished that their plane was going to crash en route to the game. And it's like, geez, like, come on.
Yeah.
We all want, our teams that we dislike to fail, but I think we're very much crossing the line there. I see a lot of it with regard to dysfunctional fandom toward women in sport media, and that's something that I've worked on and working on with my dissertation. Some of the abuse that women as sports writers get because, closed-minded people may automatically perceive because you're a woman you lack the expertise to perform your job, or you only have your job because of your looks. And just how many of the comments that you'd think we should be past that, spend more time in the kitchen instead of in the press box and things like that. But I think egregiously I think of that wanting the Oklahoma State plane to crash en route to the game stands out there, and even on instances when from the high school level in which players commit to one school over another, and you've got fans sending death threats to players for not committing to their school. Yeah, that's really gonna what if they want to transfer? Transferring happens so often nowadays. Yeah, that's not going to help your stock down the line.
Right.
So I think we need to be cognizant. We need to take a step back. And, I admit, sometimes I get a little bit combative on there and letting my fandom get, but nothing to that extent, obviously. Nothing even close to that. But, even, perfect example, wasn't even social media related, but that letter that the Cleveland Cavaliers owner sent out after LeBron James left to go to Miami, saying that's the self-proclaimed king will never win a championship, and I guarantee it. Like, you should be damn thankful that LeBron, was able to move forward from that and come back to the Cavaliers because that could have been a death sentence that LeBron would never come back to Cleveland. And unfortunately, at that time, the owner was acting like a typical fan would do. And you need to think big picture. And unfortunately, social media, even though that wasn't done via social media allows for that to be done a lot greater.
Certainly.
Yeah.
So with all of this said, we've talked about the good and the bad, and I think I know where you stand on this. But if you had to kind of give a very brief state of the union for sports media, what do you think that would be? What is the state of sports media today? Is it strong?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we think about even just the prestige aspect of being a reporter. I mean, studies have shown that when students want to work for college newspapers, they want to work in sports because there's just that attraction, and it's because of sport, and I think it works. It goes also just working with a sport entity. It's great to be an accountant with any organization, but you say, hey, I'm an accountant with the New England Patriots. People just perceive that even greater because it's like, because we associate just sport teams with prestige. So as a sport reporter, I think you are seen in more positive fashion because you are seen as that direct conduit between the fan base and that organization. So I think because of our tremendous valuation of our sport teams that any associated media entity is going to be perceived in a lot more positive fashion. So I would say it is very strong from just a perception standpoint. Now there are issues again, like we talked about, because fans think that they know everything, in which they're constantly trying to discredit some of the work of media members. But again, I think we also have to take the good with the bad. I don't know. I can't say off the top of my head that sport reporters make more money than, say, general assignment reporters or political reporters would be. But there's more interest in their work, I would say, oftentimes because of our interest in sports as opposed to some of the other sections. So there's some celebrity status. So because of that, I say that sport media is very strong. Also from a job opportunity perspective, because working in sport and its related media entities has really just blown up over the years, I think it has really increased the amount of opportunities that young students can have in terms of future employment.
Well, and that's actually where I was going to head next. So my final question before we go into our final questions, my final sports-related question. If you're an undergraduate student listening to this right now and you're interested in sports communication and you're thinking, okay, what do I need to do, A, to get involved, and B, to have a successful career in a field like this, what advice would you give those students?
I tell my students all the time, I think you need to be able to speak well in public, because I think that radiates no matter what you do in life, and can help you in management positions. But I really think, even though you may not want to be a sport writer, your ability to communicate with others it's paramount. And so, I'm sure my students can get a little peeved at the amount of writing tasks that I give them, but it's because if you can write, I truly believe that, you can be successful at whatever you want to do. So I would say, hone your public speaking skills as much as possible, hone your writing skills as much as possible. But from a sports-specific perspective, it's all about the amount of opportunities you had. And unfortunately, so many people want to work in sport that you need to have. It's not just a matter of having 1 or 2 internship experiences. It's having 5, 6, 7. You need to show that you have that drive because there's so much demand that you really need to go all in to stand out. And I think going to a university like UConn is very beneficial because there are plenty of opportunities with such a vast athletic department. Yes, we don't have the professional market that, say, one of the benefits I had going to Temple in that, you have a lot of professional sport teams in the area, but there are a plethora of opportunities. And you have to understand that because of that demand, don't expect to get paid. As much as that might stink, we all want to be paid. You have to, just grit down and bear it because, that's just the way the industry is. You have to do as much as you possibly can and accept that you're probably not going to get a whole ton of respect. You're going to have to do a lot of grunt work. But, all of those experiences are definitely going to add up. And so you have to be as open as possible. You may want to work, somewhere over the summer and make some money so you can, have a little bit more flexibility during the academic year. Unfortunately, if you want to work in sport, you're going to have to probably take that unpaid internship. But again, it's all about building that social capital, as we say. So,
certainly.
That's again where it comes into. If you've had maybe 4 or 5 different internships, you've really expanded your network as opposed to those who have had 1 or 2. So it's really about quantity, also quality, but quantity of experience, getting, a different array of experience, working in media, working in marketing, working in operations. Unfortunately, and also you're going to have to work in sales. Now, a lot of people will say, I don't want to get into sales. But most entry-level sport jobs are sales. That's where you start. And, even if you want to work in public relations, you might have to start in sales just to get an in at an organization. So again, I think that's another aspect of where elements of persuasion can come into play.
Yeah.
So a plug to perhaps take a persuasion class, but also then the public speaking aspects that you're going to need to be able to communicate with people. I like to say most of our success in life relates back to, how we communicate with others. A theory that I use often, leader-member exchange theory, and thinking of if you're moving up in managerial levels that, of course, not everyone is going to be accepting of your decisions that you make, but if you can communicate that to them well, they're going to be more accepting and understand, right, okay, that was the rationale for it. I'm more likely to then be motivated to work for you, and that's what it's about.
Well, you give great perspective on this, and so before I give you our final 2 questions that we give every guest, I do want to point out the fact that you will not be with us here at UConn for terribly long. Where are you headed?
I'm headed to York College of Pennsylvania, so I'm very excited about that. I'm defending my dissertation soon, and so I already have a job lined up, assistant professor of sport management, so I'm very excited to continue to teach sport management. So I'll be working in sport finance, and in particular, there's a desire for me to really work on the sport comm aspect at your college. So I'll be teaching basic sport communication, some public relations classes, and things of that nature. So very excited for that. Go back to Pennsylvania. Not that like I said, I finally feel like I'm at home here in Connecticut, but very excited to go back there. I mean, it's about 2 hours from Philadelphia, actually closer to Baltimore, maybe like an hour from Baltimore. But my wife is from the area, so very helpful for her. I'm sure the dog will appreciate that as well, because more family members to shower him with attention.
Certainly. And they're getting a good one. So as we wrap up every interview, we ask 2 questions. The first of which, if you could come into COM 1000 and teach any one lecture, you get 50 minutes, what would you teach?
That's a very good question. I mean, I've never taken COM 1000, so I don't know, like, specifically everything.
You've never
that is
taken
covered.
COM 1000?
No, I haven't. Even when I was at Temple, I guess we took a mass comm class, but I guess I took it over the summer. I don't even really remember, so shame on me.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think of some of the classes that I've taught this year in our sport communication class. Is, I think the emergence of electronic media has really changed the landscape in terms of sport fandom. So maybe something from that perspective.
Okay.
Was that covered, or am I?
No. We talk about electronic media, but we don't. We only have so much time to cover sports communication, which is one of the biggest reasons that I wanted to have you on the podcast.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'd want to teach sport communication within the COM 1000. But I was trying to think of something outside that box, but
you might have been going above and beyond then.
Yeah, I guess. Yes, I overthink sometimes too.
Don't we all?
Yes.
Okay, so my final question.
Yeah.
This has been a wonderful interview, but if you could give one piece of advice to our young communication students, any realm, what would it be?
Similar to what I mentioned in terms of wanting to work in sport. It's a competitive field out there no matter what you get into, so try to get as much experience as possible. Understand, unfortunately, where you are in the totem pole, and that you have to work as hard as possible now in order to put yourself in a better position later. Oftentimes we take these things for granted. We think that things are owed to us. Nothing in life is owed to you. And so do know that you're really setting yourself up for the future. For your future. Yes, you could perhaps go back to school or, go get a graduate degree or something. But, I think we all could say we look back, we would do things differently perhaps.
Sure.
in our undergraduate days. So, try to have as much of a plan as possible, but, don't be too myopic, because, I'm a product of, yes, I changed my mind on several occasions and things have seemed to work out well. So, do know it's okay to sort of change your course, but if you can early on get a glimpse of, get an idea of what you want to do, and then really, put together a roadmap to get to that point earlier than better, you're going to be in a much better position. I think you're in a really good position here at the University of Connecticut. It's, I can tell you that from an outsider, that it is perceived very strong, across the country, and the brand here at UConn is tremendous. So, but also do what you want to do. Another thing I tell students is that, one of the worst things in life is when you walk through that doors of whatever your job is and you regret walking in there, and you dread what's going to happen the next 8 or 9 hours a day. I say this to my students, maybe they don't always believe it, but I truly enjoy the days that I come in and teach, because I love it. And that's one of the best decisions in my life that I've made, is to go this route. So do something that you truly enjoy doing. And I know that does sound cliched, but we only live life once.
Yeah.
You got to do something that you enjoy. And it just makes, it makes going through life that much more rewarding if we're doing something that we enjoy doing. So I'm glad that I've made that decision. It doesn't always come at an earlier time than others, but definitely do something you enjoy. One of the best, movie lines I've ever heard, it's from the film A Bronx Tale. The saddest thing in life is wasted talent, but I also think the saddest thing in life is just not doing what you want to do. I mean, we have the opportunities now, in most cases, to pursue what we want to do. So find out what that is, and do what you got to do to advance as much as possible. So
As I've learned doing this podcast now, I believe this is episode number 7. It seems like everybody gives really good advice, but it also seems like everybody's really passionate about that advice. So I appreciate that answer. Okay. He is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sports Management.
Yeah, we're in the Sport Management Program, Department of Educational Leadership.
Okay, Department of Educational Leadership, and he will soon be, provided all goes well, which is what we always say, the necessary caveat, but I have a funny feeling it'll go magnificently, and by the time you're listening, he might be Dr. Mike Mudrick already. Mike Mudrick, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts on this very interesting topic that we are both passionate about, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are passionate about.
Oh, I appreciate you having me anytime.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you.
So there's our interview with Mike Mudrick. Really knowledgeable and really interesting to talk to on the topic of sports communication and sports management. We appreciate you for taking the time to listen. Obviously a lot to think about and a lot to talk about, really. Thank you so much for participating in episode number 7 of Compendium. We'll be back next week with another topic, this time talking more about media and social media. Take care. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the host and his guests. They do not reflect the views of the University of Connecticut, the UConn Department of Communication, or the COM 1000 course itself.